And you've got video, I hope. All right, I'm going to do that. Okay, so now I have a confidence. You know, they call these things confidence monitors. I just learned this recently. It's a bizarre phrase. So, do you want to?
This is the part where you're actually speaking, not the idle chat.
That's true. I think I'm actually speaking. They told me to start speaking.
All right, go.
So, speak. Is that like a dog command? Speak. You know, they get a dog to. I don't know. So, so this initial background is depending on how well you follow. If you followed last session completely, then this background is not for you. But I'm going to go through it anyway because I feel like if someone wandered into the room and said, "I wanted to understand this licensing stuff," and they're talking about all these crazy things that I've never heard about before, and I don't want those people to walk out. So this is remedial for basically almost everybody in the room. But there is a lot of open source and free software that uses copyleft licenses. That's what we were talking quite a bit in the last fishbowl session about. The GNU GPL is the most widely used copyleft license. Version 2 is probably the most widely used, although there is a lot of v3 stuff out there, and there's a lot of v2 or later stuff as well. From my point of view, the main thing that Copyleft is trying to do is to give certain rights and privileges to downstream users who receive distribution of GPL software. And they should continue to have those rights and abilities to copy, modify, share, reinstall the software even after they've modified it. That was what the goal of GPL was. If you get a device that has some binary software on it, you should also get the source code, and you should also get the ability to modify it and reinstall it, because that's the whole point of software freedom from my point of view. So this is a formal definition of copyleft. It originally comes from Wikipedia. I actually have an attribution that's cut off from, we're lucky we got anything up here at all with my VGA laptop, so there's an attribution cut off at the bottom there, but it's originally from Wikipedia. We modified it somewhat to put on the copyleft.org website. So it's a CC by SA licensed definition of copyleft. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that copyleft is a strategy. It's a mechanism to get to a certain goal. And GPL enforcement as an activity is part of executing on that strategy. It's the process by which you ensure that people actually follow the rules. There's some talk lately that we should actually look for spontaneous compliance. That phrase has been used. The example given was that the Internal Revenue Service in the US only does spontaneous compliance, which is kind of funny because I actually looked at the budget of the IRS, and they spend more per year on enforcement of tax rules than I'm pretty sure anybody has ever spent ever in the history of the world in copyleft compliance. So I don't think that spontaneous compliance actually happens. I do think people look to get around the license. Behan said in the earlier session that the biggest question gets is, how do I get around the GPL? I've been getting that question since 1997 or so. It's what people, oh, you're still here. It's what people have been asking. They don't want to comply by default, so somebody has to make sure they comply. Somebody has to do it if we're going to use this strategy at all. Now, there are people out there arguing we should ditch the strategy of copyleft, and that's a debate I'm happy to have with anyone who wants to have it. But if you'll assume for the moment that we're going to have the strategy of copyleft, at least till the end of my talk when you ask questions, we should think about what are the goals of that activity? What are we trying to do? From my point of view, as I said in the earlier session when I was on the fishbowl, I'm worried about the users, the people who got the software. What rights do they have? Can they learn how the software works and then later become upstream developers? Can they get involved with software development with the stuff they got from their vendor to actually hack the device that they received, they bought at Best Buy or Fry's, or what's in Australia, what's the big electronic stores people go to buy stuff at? What's it called? Whatever they said. I couldn't hear it. Sorry, I should have researched that ahead of time. So one of the things that's happened in recent years is people have been so much debating whether the GPL should be enforced. Software Freedom Conservancy and the FSF wrote up the principles that we've historically followed for doing GPL enforcement, and that's a link to those principles because we felt that it was important to not just do enforcement for enforcement's sake. I've been accused of that, but I've never actually believed that was the right thing. Enforcement is a path to get to some certain goal, which means you have to do it in certain ways to assure that we don't, for example, hurt adoption any more than is absolutely necessary to get the strategy to work, those sorts of things. So I encourage you to read those principles. This talk really isn't about those principles. It's about something a little bit different. And it came up in the last session, too. I feel like the goal of enforcement is not about upstream. And I'm not concerned about what happens with upstream because generally upstream is compliant. It's sort of by default. Upstream developers are writing the GPL software. So they are usually in compliance by default. There have been cases, there's actually a very funny story of how Emacs violated the GPL for about 2 days and fixed the violation. It happens, right? Upstream can violate the GPL. But ultimately, it's the users that matter. The users are getting distribution of a device, and there's somebody in between upstream and the users, right? There's some company that adopted the software, put it into a product, and gave it to those users. And the GPL was designed to make sure that those users at the bottom of the chain got certain abilities to do certain things. So I'm focused on ensuring that, which means when I look at compliance problems, I see a very real-world problem that most people don't see. Most of what you hear talked about in the open chain and the XPDX world is corporate folks saying, I want an inventory of the licenses of all my source code. That's what most of those projects are trying to do. When I talk to people who are actually victims of GPL violations, that couldn't be further from their concern because they don't have any source code. They went and bought an electronics product. It was binary, it's clearly running Linux, and they got no source code whatsoever. And they don't care what licenses details were in that particular package. They just want to hack the device. So they want to get the source code so they can hack the device. Now, the GPL was designed to make sure that they could do that. It does it through these legal mechanisms. It does it by requiring that the license of the work, when you distribute it, all copyrighted material in the work, as copyright law defines in whatever jurisdiction you're in, has its complete and corresponding source code, or CCS as those 5 of us who work in this trade call it, for that work have to be provided under the terms of the GPL. Enforcement can happen because if you fail to do that, the license terminates, and then you don't have permission to distribute anymore, and then someone who is a copyright holder can come along and enforce. And part of what we talk about in those principles is how we do that, and you can read about that online. But what I want to talk about today is this thing called CCS. Like, what is that actually that we face? It's actually a technical requirement. Most of what GPL is trying to do is to give technical tools to the downstream users so that they can get involved in free software development on the devices they actually own. So the policy issues are ultimately technical issues. Most of the time we spend doing GPL compliance, those organizations that actually enforce the GPL, has nothing to do with this license inventory SPDX stuff. That just doesn't, it's looking at a side issue from my point of view. The key issue I'm worried about is, can you modify and recompile and install the darn software on the device like the GPL said you were supposed to be allowed to do? And because of the heavy adoption of Linux-based systems in the embedded environment, this has become particularly bad. I think what Rob is talking about self-hosting is incredibly important because most of these systems aren't self-hosted. So being able to actually build the source code for your television, which is a Linux box, is this incredibly complex undertaking. And the GPL is designed to make sure you can do that undertaking and you have the tools possible to do it, and that the person who distributed to you gave you those tools. But sadly, it rarely happens. So we talk about how do we get the CCS into something that adequately meets the requirements of the GPL. And it's a slow march. We go, when we're doing this work, round by round. They give us a source code release. We check it to see if we can actually build it. It doesn't build. And we send it back with comments and say, this doesn't build, and GPL says it has to build. So could you please make it build? So this is what GPLv3 says. I think that that definition is a little clearer. A lot of the things in GPLv3 clarify and make easier to read stuff that's in GPLv2. But I spend most of my day in GPLv2, not GPLv3 when I'm working on this stuff. So here's what GPLv2 says. And I've done much more GPLv2 enforcement than I have GPLv3. And it comes down often to these 11 words right here. The scripts used to control compilation and installation of the executable. That's what matters most in embedded devices most of the time, because being able to compile and reinstall is the way you actually do something useful with the source code. If you want to make your TV do something more interesting that the manufacturer didn't put in there that you want to add, well, you want to be able to recompile and reinstall your changed version. I could just talk all day about these 11 words. I've done all sorts of conversations. I had a 3-hour conference call with lawyers about what the means in that sentence, once upon a time. I'll tell you all after how that conversation played out. But when we're doing enforcement, our goal is to get that source code released for the users so that they can actually do something useful. We've had some huge successes from the enforcement, the lawsuit that Rob was involved in that he mentioned. One of the things we got out of that was Samsung actually did a source code release that worked. And it created a mod firmware community. There's a project called Samigo, which is a modified firmware for Samsung TVs. It only works on the older models. The newer models, well, I don't want to comment at the moment. But the basic rule that we follow is, can a developer who's skilled in the art actually do it? It's not like we would expect someone to teach a downstream user how to become an embedded developer. The GPL does clearly not require that you give somebody a tutorial on how to be an embedded developer. So we generally say, well, if someone who is skilled as an embedded developer can make this build, then you're probably compliant with the GPL, because that's sort of the right level of knowledge somebody should have to have. So we test, as I mentioned, these various candidates and see if they work. And for about 20 years, I've been trying to find a good example. And the reason it took so long is because almost every example I've ever found just barely crossed the line to GPL compliance. We worked and worked and worked with them, tested all these source code candidates. Finally, they got us a source code candidate that worked, it built, it installed. We declared it GPL compliant, but it wasn't pretty. It was never pretty. So we've had this, like, I know a compliant source release when I see it kind of standard, and I really wanted to find an example where we could say, this is a good example. This is something I'm proud to show other people, this is a good way to do it so that you have it right. And it was this small company called ThinkPengiun that finally did it. They're a very free software community-oriented company. They have a company plan to make all their devices hackable, rebuildable, all free software, and so forth. And they did some really great work to make a wireless router that was fully and perfectly compliant with the GPL, and also was really encouraging, not just allowing, but encouraging users to hack the device and improvement. So my colleague Denver Gingerich and I wrote a paper about this. It's part of the site Karen mentioned, copyleft.org. There's a shortened URL that will take you right to that part of copyleft.org if you want to take a look at it. That main guide has over 150 pages of lots and lots of different stuff in it. But today, I just want to tell you about this one part of it, this pristine example, if you will, of good, complete corresponding source code. Now, the first thing that people get wrong with regard to source code is using the offer for source. Lawyers just love the offer for source. They see this language in the GPL, and they say, oh yeah, that's exactly what I want. That I can write the best offer for source ever. I'm going to draft the most beautiful offer for source, and we're going to use it. I think all the lawyers who use the offer for source are bad lawyers, and you should fire them. If your lawyer tells you, oh, we're going to use the offer for source, tell your boss to fire them. Because any good lawyer knows that you shouldn't create a situation where you have ongoing obligations if you can avoid it. The offer for source has this valid for 3 years. So for 3 years, your entire production team has to keep track of, gee, which devices did we put out there, and are they still in the marketplace, and do we have to make source code available? And by the way, it's, let me find it up here, valid for any third party. That means anyone, not just the person who bought the device, can call you up and say, I heard you got Linux in your device, I want the source code. I saw the offer for source, my friend had it, I want the source code. That's a third party. That has to be valid to any third party. So it's silly to use this text. I know why it's there. Remember where GPLv2 was written in 1991? It was expensive to have things like media that had large source code on it. It was before the web. That's a good example, Rob. So there's no reason we need this anymore. No reason we need to use it anymore most of the time. So what I have tended to find is I'm suspicious as soon as I see an offer for source, with good reason. Because usually what has happened, I'm terribly cynical, I think that probably is obvious, but what usually has happened when you see an offer for source is some lawyer said, hey, developers, where's the source code for all this? Like, oh, it's on somebody's computer somewhere, we have it here, I don't know where it is, yeah, but the binary's ready to go, the product's shipping tomorrow, and the lawyer says, oh, let me look at this GPL thing. Oh, offer for source, I'll write an offer for source real quick, we'll put it in the box and we're done. We don't have to get the source code packaged together. We'll wait till somebody actually asks us for the source code before we bother to get it together. And the reason I know this is the case is because when I have seen people test the offer for source, they get emails back that say like, we will get back to you in 3 months. Which means they couldn't have put the source code release together for the GPL requirement. Now the next thing I want to mention that's really, so by the way, in the ThinkPengiun example, they didn't do an offer for source. They actually put a USB key in the box because their obligations are done. They ship it to you, they ship you the source code. You can't call them up to, assuming that USB key has the compliant source code, they're done. They don't have to talk to you again if they don't want to. They have given you everything the GPL required to them at the time they distribute it to you. So another thing that ThinkPengiun did right with theirs that I see gotten wrong a lot is to not really explain how to build the thing. Now, I've had a lot of conversation about the word scripts, too. I've had probably more than just a few hours of phone calls about that. And scripts doesn't necessarily have a technical meaning there. Most developers read that sentence and they think the word shell is in it. The word shell is not in that sentence. It doesn't have to be shell scripts. It doesn't have to be a technical anything. Think of a script of a play or a movie. Those are the lines that people have to say so that the show is actually communicating the message that it was intended to communicate. Similarly, if there are just a written set of steps someone's supposed to go to that they have to type at the keyboard, then that's the scripts used to control compilation. You just have to write them down in a README file. It's not that hard. It's not like you have to go and write shell scripts. The GPL doesn't require you to write more code, but if there's information that someone needs to know how to build it, the GPL intends that that information is somehow communicated as part of the complete corresponding source code. So you have to give them that script. You have to make them the actor in your play of how to build the software and give them something that explains how it gets built. So this is what ThinkPengiun did. They had this little README that was short, but it worked. We followed the README, and if you know what you're doing, and you read that README, and you go and do those things, it works, as it turns out. So one of the things that I know for absolute certainty that almost no one ever does, that they should do, because it's so easy, is just test your own source code release before you make it the official one. Find a developer from another department. Find a friend, whatever it is, who knows how to build stuff. Give them the stuff you're planning to give the end users, and ask them to try to build it. If they can't build it, you're not complying with the GPL, period, from my point of view. I have been saying that for 15 years at least. I have not found anybody to do it yet. I don't know of any company that's doing that. Oh, they're signing up for OpenChain and getting the SPDX files all in place. Sorry. But they don't have this as part of their thing. In fact, I don't even think this is listed in the OpenChain recommendations of what things you ought to do as part of your compliance. It's been suggested. They're not interested. Very strange. So I think this is the best thing you can do to verify if you're in compliance. Make sure somebody can build your source code. One thing that comes up quite a bit is this question about toolchains. And people have often misquoted me that I believe the toolchain is part of the scripts used to control compilation. I think it probably isn't. I don't think that was intended. Remember, the GPLv2 was written at a time when most of the toolchains were proprietary. GCC did not work that well yet in 1991. I don't think it was ever considered that if you shipped, say, a binary on Sunos, you were required to ship Sun's binary because you built it with Sun's binary. You don't have that permission anyway because Sun's compiler is under proprietary license. So I can't imagine why people, I can imagine why, but I think people are making a mistake when they say, well, it's part of the scripts used to control compilation. Well, I don't think the compiler controls compilation. It is the thing doing the compilation. It's not controlling it. So I don't think that you need to include a toolchain. Now, I do think you need to explain what toolchain you used. I think that's part of the scripts. So one of the things that I encourage people to do is do something like that. You have a question, Rob?
That's not adequate.
You think that, oh, this, you think, what's that?
C library.
Oh, which C library?
If it was built with glibc, if it was built with uclibc, you need a config file.
Right.
Musclelibc or bionic, that's what GCC.
Yeah, so I'm going to repeat what Rob just said for the recording because you don't have a mic. So Rob's making the point that the thing I have an example on the slide, that itself may not be adequate. I think the distinction I'm trying to make, Rob, is including the copy of the C library probably isn't required. Explaining which C library you used.
Just saying there's a missing line, that's all it's saying.
Yeah. I mean, this is an example, at least for the toolchain. But I agree with Rob that there's a whole environment you often need to build one of these things and explain. I mean, I think ThinkPengiun did a pretty good job of explaining. Well, I could go back to the README, but you have to kind of explain the environment you were in when you built it, so that you can make sure somebody downstream can build it. Now, I think it's great when people do include a copy of the toolchain. I encourage it if it's possible to give the toolchain you actually used. But remember, the toolchain is also, if it's GCC, GPL'd, which means if you include the toolchain, you have a GPL obligation there. So you probably don't want to do that if you are trying not to expand your GPL vector of compliance that you need to pay attention to, but it's a nice thing to do. Now, I think a lot of people thought about installation in the early days as well. You know, make install has to work. And certainly in 1991, that was probably, if you had a reasonable make install that copied a bunch of binaries into user local bin or something like that, that was probably all a program written for a Unix server up environment needed as far as install. Embedded products are just not so easy to install. And therefore, the instructions on how to do it are probably pretty complicated, which means if you need to give the scripts to control installation, you've got to explain it pretty well. And it is required. You can't just skip this part and say, oh, I gave the scripts to control compilation and not give the ones for installation. It says it. It's right there in GPLv2. One of the interesting things that came up when we were checking this one from ThinkPengiun was there was an actual piece of hardware you needed to connect up to the wireless router. And if you didn't have it, you couldn't actually do the install. We actually had to go buy one, right? We got to that point in the instructions. They didn't include it in the package. They said, oh, if you want to actually do this install, you've got to go buy this thing. It was because there was this particular wireless router only had a serial port on the back, and you needed this little USB serial adapter we didn't have, and we had to actually need a different pin out for some reason. The details are in the paper. But we said, okay, well, we don't have one of these things, so we have to go buy it. I felt that was no problem at all from a compliance perspective. If you don't have the hardware needed to do the install, and you have to go buy it to make the install work, you have to go buy it to make the install work. It's not, the GPL doesn't say you must include the hardware used to control installation, for example. Yeah, it's a tool that you need, right, yeah. So I'll just summarize up because I'm almost out of time. The whole goal here is user freedom, from my point of view. Making sure users can install stuff on their devices is what I care about most. I want the advent of free software on lots of Internet of Things devices to bring about a groundswell of new people to get excited about hacking their devices. And from my point of view, I want to see the GPL used as a tool to make that happen. And I think Rob's points about the issues with host systems are problematic. I hope for a day when everything's self-hosted. But until we get to that day, you've got to tell people what host system you need to build a thing and how it has to be configured. And you have to explain the details of the toolchain or anything that you need present in the environment to make it work. You don't necessarily have to give those things, but you have to explain what you had when you were doing it. Another great example is in the Windows world. A lot of GPL software on Windows says you have to have a copy of Visual Studio. Well, Visual Studio, I don't know how much Microsoft charges these days for Visual Studio. You might have to go buy that to build that software.
It's actually open source
Okay. Okay, that's good to hear. Well, I'll be interested when they open source Microsoft Office from my point of view. But anyway, so I think this thing about having a colleague build your software, I think that's the big, if you take away anything from this talk about how to improve your own company's processes, if you're involved in embedded development, that's the thing to do. I want to finish up by mentioning that you know, I'm critical, I'm very publicly critical of these projects like SPDX and OpenChain and so forth. I took my criticism to them first. They weren't interested in hearing it, so now I take it to you, the public. But I think that there is one project I've seen that's really important that has a real impact on the future of compliance, and that's came out of the Debian community initially, but it's wider than that now, called reproducible builds. Basically, everything I'm describing here is a reproducible builds question. And it wasn't their intent to design a GPL compliance solution. They're doing reproducible builds for a whole different other set of reasons. But the fact of the matter is that if everybody's builds are reproducible, GPL compliance will be very trivial. And I encourage you all to go to Valerie's talk on Thursday. She's going to be talking about reproducible builds, and I think if you have time to volunteer for a project that you want it to be technical, I don't recommend getting involved in licensing details as a hobby. I did it, and now it's my job, and yeah. Okay, well, if you like it, that's fine, but if you want a technical project that you'd like to work on that will help GPL compliance, reproducible builds might be it. Or help Rob make things self-hosting, that would be another thing to do. And if you want to learn more generally about Copyleft, Karen and I are teaching a tutorial on Thursday, so you can come hear more gory details about how Copyleft works. And that's pretty much it. So do I have time for questions, Deb?
One or two, but if people want to get lunch, they should feel free to do that.
So leave for lunch or stay for questions as you prefer. I will not be offended if you walk away right now.
I just wanted to
Get a mic for, actually, can we get the mics? Because I know they're recording the talk. No, we do.
I just wanted to point out that in addition to the reproducible build stuff, what Google is working towards, the term they use for it is hermetic builds, where you basically git clone a repository and run it, and it should run on any system because it provides its own dependencies beyond a POSIX shell and C99 compiler.
It's good.
Everything else, it builds itself and populates its own path with those things.
Yep.
So the term they use is hermetic build.
Yeah, from what you're saying, I'm a fan of it. Can you hand the mic back there?
Thanks. How do you test for compliance if the device that the kernel needs to run on has some sort of encrypted bootloader or TiVoization or?
So since you asked about it, this is an often asked question about whether cryptographic lockdown is actually something that is allowed under GPL. And GPLv3 was certainly designed to not permit cryptographic lockdown. I've long held the position that there's really no difference on this matter between GPL v2 and v3. Install to me means install, and if it's cryptographic lockdown, I think you should be allowed to install it. We've had so much said about GPL v2 and whether it allows crypto lockdown that I think that's an untenable position for me to hold. So I would generally agree that if something is cryptographically locked down, that GPL v2 does not require that you give the information on how to circumvent the encryption. But I do believe scripts used to install require everything but that. So I would expect to see, if something's crypto lockdown, to say a list of steps, and when you get to a step says, and in this step you put a secret key here, and type install, and it installs. And you don't have the secret key. So you can't actually execute that step yourself, but it should be giving everything but, from my point of view, on how to actually do the install. So Behan, your hand went up, and then there's one over there. Rob, since you already asked, I'm going to come back to you at the end.
We've actually talked about this before as well, but one of the things I've asked you about in the past is the ability to turn a device such as that into developer mode where basically encryption is turned off. And I would love if you could repeat what your answer was to that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent way to handle this problem. I mean, the early Android phones, I mean, the one that I carry, which is very old, I did the 5 clicks somewhere and it was in developer mode and I can reinstall it, right? So from my point of view, that's absolutely reasonable. absolutely GPL. I can't see a reason why it's not GPL compliant anyway.
I know the reason that Android stopped doing that is what they call the evil butler problem. When the NSA went, after Snowden came out, they basically went, okay, what if someone gets your phone for 15 minutes, re-images it so that it's listening to you and you don't know? So they changed the bootloader to you can reinstall it, but every time you do so from then on, the bootloader will stop there and go, this is not a stock image, you're aware of that, right? And you can never turn that off. And they're going, if you have a better solution, please tell us.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I should have the cryptographic keys for my own device. I mean, as a policy matter, I should be able to lock down my own device by installing my own software and using my own GPG key, meaning you need my GPG key to reinstall. But that's the world I would like to live in, not the world I actually live in.
So I'm jumping back on the usefulness of reproducible builds. Could you give some details on how this can be useful? Indeed, usually the official firmware for embedded devices contain a combination of GPL work and non-GPL work, like proprietary stuff on top of it. So the official firmware that you get is usually a combination of these, while the GPL drop that you get only has like GPL and maybe BIZ license source code. So what you can rebuild is definitely not going to be the same as the official firmware that is installed on the device or otherwise available on the vendor website. So even with reproducible build, you're not going to get a binary identical build to the official firmware.
I think you're basically correct in what you're saying, and I agree with it. That if you have reproducible builds on embedded devices, you're going to be able to reproduce the GPL software, get the binaries, and those should check out. Those should be verifiably reproducible and rebuilt. But most firmwares, and I'm going to disagree with one word you use, I don't think if they're a combination in the combined or derivative work sense of GPL and non-GPL software, they're violating the GPL because you're not allowed to make such combinations. What I think you meant is they're an aggregation, i.e. the operating system is Linux and then user space has some big proprietary app, right? Absolutely, I would expect as part of GPL compliance that when I reinstall, I get boot to a Toybox shell or a BusyBox shell and I have no app. In fact, I have an interesting anecdote about this. So in GPLv3, I actually am abhorrently opposed to calling cryptographic lockdown TiVoization, and here's why. Because while TiVo will not use GPLv3 software, I cannot see TiVo's current mechanism being a violation of GPLv3, and here's why. Because while the TiVo devices are cryptographically locked down, when you reinstall the GPLv2 software on it, you can. It's just TiVo's application has evaporated and will not run. Because TiVo's application says, am I running a kernel I trust, quote unquote, trust in quotes, and if it's not, it will not run the proprietary app. So you can easily turn your TiVo box into a Kodi box by recompiling Linux and then installing Kodi, but you can't run TiVo anymore. And GPLv3 actually says this, that you only have to be able to reinstall the GPLv3 parts, and you get no guarantees with regard to the proprietary stuff. And I wish more vendors really understood this, because they could, most of them are proprietary in user space, which means they could quite happily give people the ability to reinstall your TV, and none of your smart TV stuff works. And the reason I think that's a fine outcome, because you might say, well, then how do people actually hack these things, is it will inspire OpenWRT, SamiGo, and other type of communities to make free firmwares based on things like Kodi in the TV example to give people truly free software on their TVs. But if you can't get to the first step where you can recompile and reinstall Linux and actually see, oh, most of that stuff I had was proprietary, and if I'm a developer, I'm going to say, well, now where do I find components that are free that I can put on there? Well, here's Kodi. Let's see if I can get Kodi to run on my Samsung TV by rebuilding it with SamiGo, right? And that kind of hacker community that has traditionally been created thanks to GPL enforcement, by the way. OpenWRT exists because of a GPL enforcement action that the FSF did. We can do more of that by really making sure the CCS works. Because if that Linksys CCS had not worked, that was one of the first big CCS checks I ever did in my career back when I used to work for the FSF, we wouldn't have OpenWRT because they wouldn't have had an initial check-in to get started with that actually ran and worked. So I think that letting the proprietary apps just not work is a perfectly fine outcome, and I'm just absolutely tickled that that happens. I don't want proprietary software, right? I think it's a feature that GPLv3 says the proprietary software can't work anymore, because I don't want people using TiVo software. I want them to install Kodi.
Okay, folks, we reconvene at 1:20. Thank you very much.
Thanks for hanging around before lunch.